Let's record it for a second first.
Okay, just right here. So
Let's speak after that. That is all good to go. We're including your hands.
Should we get?
Good afternoon, everyone. We are delighted to be hosting the Global Classroom today, and we're very honoured that we have former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson. She is currently the United Nations Secretary General, Special Envoy on Climate Change, and she's also President of the Mary Robinson Climate Justice Foundation. So if you'd like to join me in welcoming former President Robinson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Padraig, and I'm very happy to be here because I enjoy the Global Classroom, in particular when we get to the questions and dialogue with students here in Dublin, but also students in different campuses around the world. It's really good that we can connect in this way. My foundation, the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice, when it was established, was linked deliberately with both Trinity and University College Dublin. So knowing that the students here in Dublin learn in both campuses, it's a good way of consolidating that connection. We have two board members from the two universities on our board of my foundation. And I've been asked, and indeed I'm happy to talk today about social inclusion, human rights and gender equality. And what I would like to emphasize, first of all, is the importance of next year, 2015. It's important not only for the Sustainable Development Goals process, which will be negotiated from January and conclude, we hope, with the Sustainable Development Goals being adopted in September at the General Assembly of the United Nations. And before that, in Addis Ababa in July, there will be an important Financing for Development conference. And then later in the year, in December, we will have the Climate Summit, the 21st Conference of the Parties on Climate, to adopt what we hope will be a fair, equitable, ambitious, legally binding agreement, which keeps us below the 2 degrees Celsius, which governments have agreed is what is necessary, basically, for a safe world. And the work of my foundation, the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice, really is at the nexus of those two processes. So we will track both the Sustainable Development Goal agenda and the climate agenda next year. And there's an interesting link between them, of course, because the Sustainable Development Goal agenda has a goal on climate. Goal 13 is a separate goal on climate, and we would be very keen that that remain as a separate goal. Because there's a kind of interesting issue of timing, which I don't think people are conscious enough about or talk enough about. So maybe it's something we can discuss a little bit. It is envisaged that when the Sustainable Development Goals are adopted in September, they would come into operation on the 1st of January 2016. But the climate agreement, which hopefully will be adopted by the heads of state and government in December, doesn't come into effect until 2020. So there's a certain gap, and that's why next March, when governments are to indicate their intended nationally determined commitments, it's the intended nationally determined commitments for 2020 to 2025 to 2030 to 2040 to 2050. So in the meantime, there is a second track which is working on the period from 2015 to 2020, but it's not clear how that will link exactly with the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. But there's no doubt that these two processes have the potential to transform societies and enable inclusive and equitable development around the world. So what I want to do today is to focus on the challenges that climate change poses to issues of social inclusion and gender equality, and also to the attainment of fundamental human rights, and how applying a climate justice lens can ensure that the policy responses are fair and equitable and don't have unintended negative consequences. Let me give you an example which clearly illustrates this. We wanted to encourage biofuels a few years ago. And in particular, in the United States, there was a rush into corn for biofuels, which immediately drove up food prices in Latin America in particular, but actually globally, because others were following that not very good example. So what is a climate justice approach? It's an approach that uses human rights standards and commitments to inform these processes, creating important connections between them and ensuring a people-centered approach which delivers outcomes which are fair, effective and transformative. Climate justice links human rights and development to achieve a human-centered approach, safeguarding the rights of the most vulnerable and sharing the burdens and benefits of climate change and its resolution equitably and fairly. It's about protecting those who have the least capacity to protect themselves and who have the least responsibility for the causes of the problem. I do feel that the injustice of climate is very, very evident and very cruel in a way, that the impacts are felt soonest by the most vulnerable countries and communities, and by communities in rich countries who are vulnerable, as we saw with the Hurricane Katrina and Sandy in the United States. It was the poorest parts which were worst hit and take much longer to recover. It's the same all over the world. So under a climate justice approach, no one should be left behind, which means that we will have to prioritize those whose livelihoods will be undermined by climate change, whose poor livelihoods will be undermined further by climate change. And climate justice requires that we give voice to those who are marginalized and vulnerable and affected by climate, and understand both their realities and their solutions, because many people and communities in areas most impacted by climate change have developed innovative solutions, and they've learned from the actual felt experience, not from books. I remember about 2 years ago, my foundation hosted with the Irish government a conference on hunger, nutrition, climate justice. And we invited to Dublin during Ireland's presidency of the European Union about 300 participants, 100 of whom were from grassroots communities all around the world, from Mongolia to the Arctic, to Latin America, to all parts of Africa, small island states, whatever. And they were a fascinating part of the conference, sitting in learning circles with ministers and commissioners of EU countries. And the impact was extraordinary, because these people, as one woman said, I hear the phrase a lot, thinking outside the box. We don't have that problem because we don't think in boxes. And it was a very true remark, because at a development level, we very often take things in boxes. And we talk about health in one box, and education in another box, and equality in another box, and so on. But at grassroots level, that's just not a problem. And of course, it's important always that climate justice is informed by science, responds to science, and acknowledges the need for equitable stewardship of the world's resources. And we have on our website the principles of climate justice. The website is www.mrfcj.org, the letters of the foundation. And in our own work, we stay very true to those principles. I want to talk now a little bit about the science, because it too has become much clearer during 2014. Earlier this month, we had the synthesis report of the 5th assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I have the synopsis here with me. The report, which it's important to say has the endorsement of 195 countries. So while the scientists were concluding the synthesis report, gathering in the key messages from the 3 reports of the working groups that had come out earlier, there were 195 countries represented there, and they went over it line by line, word by word. So the outcome is not just scientists telling us, it's scientists and 195 countries agreeing that we are in a very precarious position, if I may say so, though the report doesn't say exactly that. It states unequivocally that climate is changing, that human activity is the primary cause of these changes, and that if we don't take action urgently, we will irreparably damage the natural systems on which life depends. And it's interesting that the report supports the basic principles of climate justice, that climate action is critical to sustainable development and poverty reduction, that those who have contributed least to the causes of climate action are most vulnerable to the impacts, and that, and I quote, mitigation and adaptation raise issues of equity, justice, and fairness. It also states that delaying climate action shifts the burden of responsibility to future generations, and that acting now is the only effective and fair strategy, bringing out that intergenerational injustice of climate change. The report establishes the negative impacts on human rights, from growing food insecurity to water shortages and health impacts, and the direct effects of extreme events, which is loss of life in many instances, in terrible floods and droughts and heat waves. As I mentioned, it's the latest in a series released throughout the year by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, all of which show the impacts of that climate change are being felt now, and that we're on a path to potentially destructive climate change if we continue along the course we're going. So let's come then to human rights. To me, and I've become increasingly convinced of this, climate change is the biggest human rights issue of the 21st century, because it can lead to the destruction of the ecosystem, which is our world, and because the impacts are felt more severely by those who are more vulnerable and least responsible. So a climate agreement based on fairness and grounded on human rights maximizes the potential for climate actions that are good for the planet and also good for people. And human rights play a role in all aspects of climate action, from procedural rights, such as participation and access to information, to the substantive rights, such as the rights to food and to health, that we seek to protect from the impacts of climate change. The main impacts were set out in more detail, as you may know, in Working Group 2 of the IPCC, and I'm not going to go into them in detail now. I want to come more to how we increase the rights-based approach focus on all people achieving at least the minimum conditions for living with dignity through the realization of their human rights. Research commissioned by my foundation has identified 3 important steps that can be taken for human rights in 2015, and we're working hard on that. The first is renewed recognition by the Human Rights Council of the urgent need for ambitious and equitable action on climate change. In 2004 and in some subsequent years, the Human Rights Council passed several resolutions noting the negative impact of climate on the enjoyment of human rights. And that actually influenced the conference in Mexico, in Cancun. And there was a phrase that climate actions should respect all human rights. All climate actions should respect all human rights. We're trying to ensure that in Paris, that phrase will be strengthened. And we were supported by an important boost, if you like, when 28 of the independent experts under the Human Rights Council, they're known as the Special Procedures of the Human Rights Council, 28 of them wrote an open letter to the parties to the UNFCCC, emphasizing these points and stressing the fact that climate change threatens to undermine the protection of human rights, and that the UNFCCC has a crucial role in effectively protecting human rights for all. And then the UN experts in that letter urge the parties to, and I quote, urge them to include language in the 2015 climate agreement that provides that the parties shall, in all climate change related actions, respect, protect, promote and fulfill human rights for all. And they also urged the state parties at COP20 in Lima, first of all, to launch a work program to ensure that human rights are integrated into all aspects of climate change, all aspects of climate actions, in effect. Now, my foundation is working with countries to support the language proposed by the special mandate holders for the inclusion in the climate agreement, and also to ensure that the protection of human rights is inclusive and equitable and for sustainable development. And so that's for the climate agreement itself. On the other track, the post-2015, there was reluctance, as some of you will have noted, to include strong human rights reference, a strong reference to human rights in the outcome document of the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals. But it does reference the Rio+20 outcome document, The Future We Want, and its reaffirmation of the importance of respect for all human rights, including the right to development and the right to an adequate standard of living and the right to food and water. There's another report I'd just like to flag briefly, since we're in a law school, the Sutherland Law School here in University College Dublin, and that is the International Bar Association's Task Force report, which has just come out, it's called Achieving Justice and Human Rights in an Era of Climate Disruption. I take some responsibility for the task force because the International Bar Association came to Dublin in 2012, 2 years ago, and I was one of the speakers. And I have a habit, when I have a large, distinguished audience in front of me, of challenging them. So I told them that law in general and legal practitioners were behind the curve altogether on climate, didn't understand why it was so important, and that they should establish a task force and produce a report. And then I had to go all the way to Tokyo recently for the launch of this report because they exceeded my expectations. They were better than I had hoped. And the report is a very important one, especially for the legal profession. And it does set out in great detail and makes a number of recommendations which the task force has agreed it will now try to implement. So it hasn't just issued a report and said we'll now sign off and somebody else can do it. They're going to stay with it and try to implement a number of the recommendations. And I think the next issue that I want to really focus on is gender equality. Climate action is an area where women across all sections of society are beginning to lead and are understanding the importance of leading because of the very strong gender dimensions to climate change. If you undermine poor livelihoods, who picks up the pieces? Who has to go further for the wood or the water? Who has to put food on the table, even if climate changes are undermining that possibility? And so it has been very important and one of the priorities of my foundation to emphasize and give opportunities to bring women leaders together on climate change. The most recent example was in 2 days before the eve of the climate summit in New York in September. The evening before, my foundation and UN Women brought together women leaders under the title of Women's Leadership Forum, Raising Ambition for Climate Action. And over 130 women from 54 nations, representing current and former heads of state and government, ministers, leaders from grassroots, youth and indigenous organizations, civil society, the private sector, the scientific community, and the UN system, came together to demonstrate women's leadership on climate action and to highlight the gender responsive actions at all levels which would be needed. We discussed climate action that would benefit the climate while also benefiting people and protecting their rights. Responding to climate change means doing things differently. And doing things differently means it's possible to break away from old norms. So climate action can be gender sensitive and can protect rights. It can be designed to reduce inequalities and to contribute to poverty reduction. And by amplifying the voices of women leaders at all levels participating in the forum, we sought to inject an increased sense of urgency into government efforts to develop innovative, sustainable and inclusive responses to the climate change challenge. Obviously, we will also need a strong sustainable development goal on gender equality. This will be critical in ensuring that women are full participants at all levels of decision making in political, economic and public life. And you may remember that there was a report in 2012 of the World Bank, the World Development Report, which found that eliminating barriers that discriminate against women working in certain sectors or occupations would increase labour productivity by as much as 25% in some countries. So enhancing women's land rights would increase yields and increasing resilience to the impacts of climate change. Respecting the right to participation would enable women's voices to be heard and result in more equitable practices. So that was the more recent example. This was based on an earlier initiative which we began in Cancun. And we had noted that although the delegates to climate conferences were mainly men, it so happened that there were 3 climate conferences in succession presided over by women. The first was in Copenhagen when Connie Hedegaard was initially the minister and president of the COP before she went to become the commissioner on climate action. And then when we moved to Mexico, it was the foreign minister, Patricia Espinosa. And then the following year, it would be the Minister for International Cooperation of South Africa, Maite Masherbane. So thank you. We persuaded these three women that they would form a troika plus of women leaders. I didn't know at that stage that the word troika would become very unpopular in Ireland because of our bailout problems, but never mind. And this troika plus of women leaders became and is quite a valuable network of mainly ministers of environment and energy, because they're the ones who attend conferences on climate, but also heads of agencies at the UN. And we have a number of supportive men, usually ministers also, who support the Troika Plus of women leaders. In South Africa, we sat during the conference in Durban and plotted how to bring gender into the climate conference. And we worked very hard and very effectively for a year because we were talking about ministers who were going to be at the table. So the South African minister said, I'll take the African group. The Mexican head of delegation said, I'll look after Mexico and Latin America. The United States was supportive. Finland was the one who got the European Union to adopt, all 28 countries of the European Union to strongly support. And small island states were brought together and LDCs, etc. And so when we came to Doha, to that conference, we had a big groundswell of support for this. We had a new text on gender, which would ensure that gender would be an item on the agenda of every conference, and that every delegation would have to work to get gender balance, meaning 50-50 in the delegation, and that there would be gender balance in all the bodies of the conference and of the Kyoto Protocol. So things like the Green Climate Fund would have to be gender balanced, etc. And we tabled this item, and it was going to be moved by the European Union on behalf of the Troika of women leaders. And then a lawyer, lawyers can sometimes be very, very, very annoying. A lawyer in the European Commission looked at the rules of conferences of the parties and discovered that you can't actually table something and then normally have it agreed at the same conference. So you table and it has an initial debate and then it goes on to the next conference before decision. So Christiana Figueres, who's a good friend, the executive secretary, called me into her office looking very distressed and said, Mary, we have a problem. I'm afraid it's almost impossible now. And I said, well, Christiana, define almost. And she said, you know, the president of a conference has a certain leeway. And if we could show that there's great support for this, he could say, I see that there is great support from the floor, and he could send it for proper negotiation. And that was what happened. It was called the Doha Miracle. And we will be working with others during the Lima conference. We're focused now primarily on human rights. We're leaving gender to many other organizations who are taking up that particular issue. But these are not abstract concepts. These are extraordinarily important if we're going to have a fair, equitable agreement, because equitable is an extraordinarily important component. It's in the convention itself. Equity is in the convention, but we have to find ways to ensure through a more people-centered approach that we do have a fair, ambitious, binding outcome in Paris, because otherwise we won't stay below 2 degrees Celsius and we won't get the commitment to emissions reductions which are going to be needed. It's thought that when we see the commitments of governments next March, maybe shortly after March, we'll have a sense of the intended nationally determined commitments that countries are going to make, particularly to cut emissions, although developing countries also want adaptation and transfer of technology and finance to be in the intended nationally determined commitments. That's something that has to be discussed in Lima. But when we add it all up, it won't be enough. We know that. Voluntarily, countries will not do enough. So that's why we need the legally binding commitment to 2 degrees, staying below 2 degrees, and we need to constantly review and increase the ambition and do it equitably and bear in mind the human rights and gender dimensions. And that's really the heart of the work that I'm engaged in, both in my capacity as the Secretary General Special Envoy on Climate Change. In that capacity, I'm more persuading heads of state and government to make the necessary commitments and to ensure that Paris will be a success, and that will get us to be on course for a safe world. But for working in the foundation, we work on, as I said, both processes and work on both of them from a human rights, gender and equitable focus. And now I would like to stop at this point because I already know that I have some questions. In fact, I think I have all the 10 potential questions that you wanted to ask, and I think it's time to come on to the questions. Yeah, I haven't. I mean, the last time students asked their questions, is it now a case of me reading out and then responding to questions, or what's the story?
Yes, that's probably the simplest way. Do you want to read the questions for me to Mr. Robinson?
It's fine. I think we have a list of questions that we compiled, and then there's also a list of questions that
Okay.
Yeah. Well, yes, I have, this list is the Irish list. Those sitting in front of me are not all Irish by any manner of means, as I've discovered, which is good, but it's the Irish-based list. And then I have another list, which is coming in from other countries. So maybe I'll pick one from each, and then we can, okay, I haven't seen these before, so I'm going to read it out and think about it as I read it out. Do you feel that your foundation's climate justice platform, Climate Smart and Gender Sensitive, has been appropriately integrated into the Sustainable Development Goal drafting process? Do you think these issues should be addressed as their own goal, or should be mainstreamed through the entire document, like education has in the initial drafts? I think that's a very good question, because it was part of our thinking during this year, starting in January. I remember going to New York and speaking publicly in New York on behalf of my foundation and saying there should be a separate goal on climate change. And very few people were actually saying it at the time. And then it became more evident that it would be valuable to have a separate goal, not least because of the fact that the Sustainable Development Goals come into operation on the 1st of January 2016, whereas the climate agreement doesn't come into full effect until 2020. And we need as much pressure for sustainable behavior between 2016 and 2020 as possible. So that, I think, led to the idea of a separate goal, Goal 13. And as I indicated, I would be very keen that that would be retained, and that I have to be careful now, because the Secretary General is my boss, and he will be issuing this Thursday a synthesis report on the process so far. So let's wait and see what he says, but I hope that he will agree, or else not necessarily reference the separate goal on climate. But I do think it is very important that we should try to keep it. The first question on the other list is from Angela Kohama, and she talks about the SDGs, the post-2015 agenda, and draft goal 5, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. And then the essential question she asks is, how should programming and policy-based solutions address gender-based inequality to target including the most marginalized populations? How should we adjust our targets and vision to account for culturally based differences? And I think that's a very good question, because in fact, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, apply to all countries. The Millennium Development Goals mainly applied to developing countries. Goal 8, which we never fully lived up to, applied to the rich countries that were supposed to commit 0.7% of their GDP and finance development. So in a way, the answer on the most marginalized and poorest populations, of whom women will be the poorest of those populations, a lot depends on the kind of support and resourcing that will be available, on the financing for development that will be available to help the poorest countries to have education systems and health systems, other systems in place which will help the equality. So I would say this is an issue for the Financing for Development conference in Addis Ababa in July, as well as framing the targets and indicators in such a way that it's clear that they don't become an unfair burden on the poorest countries, but rather enable them to move faster to a position where they have attained an equality that will be better for women, that they, for example, land rights is a huge issue, in that I know from my work in Africa that we deal with figures that approximately 70% of the farming in Africa is done by women who own less than 2% of the land. So, you know, the inequity of that, and the relevance now when climate is undermining food security, and women need the asset to be able to work on it, to use it as credit, to borrow, to become stronger in resilience. Okay, so the second question that is posed here in Dublin is, what are the responsibilities of corporations, and what is the motivation or incentive for corporations to include human rights in their agenda? Very good question again. In my time, and I'm very old, in my time, I've actually done an awful lot of work on corporations and human rights, business and human rights. And it has evolved over time. When I served as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, there was a small unit in my office. This was starting in 1997. And I found out that there was a small team working on business and human rights. And their approach was, business is bad for human rights. Bad for the rights of indigenous peoples, bad for the landless, bad, just bad. And I felt, well, that's a little bit narrow. Maybe business can sometimes also be good. And so we evolved to what in fact is the responsibility of business in the area of human rights. And when I finished my work as High Commissioner for Human Rights, I had moved to New York, and I had established an organization called Realizing Rights. And one of our objectives was corporate responsibility in the area of human rights. And we worked very closely with Professor John Ruggie, who had been asked by Kofi Annan to be his special representative on business and human rights, and to devise a way of getting over problems that had occurred as to what exactly was the responsibility of corporations in the area of human rights. And he worked over a period of 6 years and reported to the Human Rights Council and indeed to the General Assembly. But in his first significant report after 3 years, he identified a framework around 3 words: protect, respect, and remedy. And the protect was the duty of states, and they had a duty to protect their people from violations of their human rights by corporations. First time that had ever been said so clearly. And the second word, respect, was that all corporations have a responsibility to respect all human rights. And the third thing was that there were not enough remedies, not necessarily always court remedies, but maybe mediation remedies, other kinds of remedies for a failure to protect human rights or respect human rights. And the Human Rights Council adopted this agenda unanimously and asked Professor Ruggie to draw up UN guiding principles. And I'm sure that some of you know the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And he spent the next 3 years drawing up those principles. And as far as corporations were concerned, he said that in talking about them having a responsibility to respect all human rights, that this wasn't just a passive, do no harm, do nothing kind of thing. It was a due diligence requirement. So they had to know what their corporation was doing right down the supply chain in order to satisfy that responsibility. And the interesting thing is, we have now recommended that the UN guiding principles on business and human rights are perfect for companies to adopt climate justice. They can adopt the climate justice approach in exactly the same way, by our due diligence and by seeing what happens along the line. But we're now much clearer on what the responsibilities of corporations are in this area. Now, the next question, maybe I'll take it from somebody else, because there were several questions from Angela Kohama. Oh no, sorry, this next question is from Amelia Conrad, so I will take it. And it's also a very good question, because she says she's an advocate of gender empowerment, but she says she doesn't like approaches that try to use girls for development purposes. She says, like the idea of the girl effect. In the Catchy campaign and beyond, it is currently very trendy to discuss the linkage between girls' education and all sorts of development gains, reduced child marriage, lower fertility rates, economic improvements, and more. And she says what she feels is more important is that the focus would be on that it is their human right, that it shouldn't just be let's educate girls because it'll be good for communities. Let's educate girls because they have a human right to that education, and then only secondly that it would be. And I think it's a very good point, in fact, because the reality is that girls in many, many parts of the world have an inherent sense that they're not as important as their brothers. And they get that from their parents, they get it from their brothers, they get it from the society, they get it from everywhere. They may even get it from the fact that girls are terminated in the womb if it's known to be a girl fetus, because the boy is the one that is more desired. And there are millions of examples of that in Asia. So from the very beginning, there is this inherent sense of not being as important. You don't have the same access to schooling. If there's a sick family member, you're taken out of school to look after them. You're not expected to acquire particular skills because you're not expected to have any future of that sort, and all the way along the line. So I would very much agree. I think the most important thing is to champion the human rights of girls, and then realize that it will have beneficial impacts, but they're secondary. So I think that was a very good question. Now, the third question is, how do you respond? This is from Dublin. How do you respond to the policy of reserving the right to not respect local laws when addressing civil societies and governments undertaking the developing world? The UN Charter includes the responsibility to protect, but how and who draws the line between limiting local sovereignty and addressing human rights violations? That's a very big question and a very political one. Unfortunately, the responsibility to protect, which the then Secretary General Kofi Annan was very keen on, and I was very keen on as High Commissioner for Human Rights, has become very politicized because, in fact, it does address very key issues of government policy, and government tries to say this is our sovereignty. I happen to always have felt, even with the UN itself, when I was serving as High Commissioner for Human Rights, I liked to say that I served the first 3 words of the Charter of the United Nations: we the peoples, and there's an S, we the peoples. Equally, to me, the sovereignty of any country is its people. It may not be what the Constitution says, but in fact, if you really want to talk about sovereignty and human rights, it has to be the people, not the government. But governments don't want interference with their policy, even if their policy is violating rights of a minority, violating rights of whoever it is. So it has become a big political problem, perhaps too big to be answered in full in this, but an interesting question. Now, yes, until quite recently, this is from Amelia Conrad again. I better go on to somebody else. Just to be fair, Victoria Phoenix. She asked a number of questions. I think one that interests me is how, as a development practitioner, do you respect local cultures and still empower women? I think that actually is a very good question, because it's something that I used to be faced with a lot when I was serving as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, that somehow human rights are a Western ideology and don't fit local cultures. And I never heard that from people at grassroots. I heard that from dictators and government leaders who didn't want to fully promote human rights in their countries, and that this was somehow a Western culture. In fact, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drawn up drawing on the different religions of the world and also humanitarian principles, and went out of its way not to be perceived as coming from any one particular place. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been accepted by every country in the world. Even those with not very good human rights records, they all unequivocally accept the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But what about local cultures? I think we have to be very aware of differences here. First of all, I believe that human rights should be embedded in the culture of a people, so that it is something that they feel very strongly is theirs. So that's very important. But if there are local traditions that are harmful, they should not be allowed to undermine human rights. And so instead of saying local culture in some instances, we should say harmful local traditions. And obviously early child marriage, where in certain areas I visited with the elders that I belong to in the Bihar state in India or in the Amhara region in Ethiopia, even though the law of the land said nobody should marry under 18, the local practice was girls, the average age of marriage of girls was 12, which means that a number of girls were marrying lower than 12, 8, 9, 10. And that's a harmful local practice. It's harmful to the girl, it's harmful if she becomes pregnant, and so on. And equally, genital cutting and other practices are harmful traditional practices. But we've also learned that the way to tackle harmful traditional practices is not to come in from the outside and preach. It's to work locally with the local community, and not just women and girls, but the imams and the fathers and the men of the village as well, in order to ensure that the issue is addressed. Now, back to, yes, your question 4 here in Dublin. Given the huge turnout at the climate rally in New York this year, how effective are protests and passive disobedience actions in affecting concrete policy and top-level engagement for complex global issues, such as climate change, when you consider the short-term life cycle of politicians? I like that bit. I was on that climate march in New York. Was anybody else on it? It was fantastic. It was one of the most joyful experiences I've had in recent years, because the sun was shining. It was actually quite warm, maybe too warm at times, and you had 400,000 people who came out in smiling, peaceful desire to march for climate action and to join everybody else in marching for climate action. It was a wonderful experience. I saw a lot of signs for Indigenous peoples because they were being favoured in where they could take place in the march. I saw signs for the Bronx. I saw actually a label for angry grannies, and I nearly joined that one because I'm definitely an angry granny on climate. It was just wonderful. And the very fact that the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon had said several days in advance that he was going to be there meant that there wasn't a sense of them and us. There was a huge sense of we. We are here because we want climate action. And I think it did very much. Many of the heads of state or government who spoke at the climate summit referenced the march. A number of senior ministers had taken part in the march. And I think it was so overwhelming, and to think that there were 1,500 other events all around the world on the same day meant that they were getting the message that politically they needed to do something about climate. And I know from my previous experience of being in elected political positions that numbers matter. And when numbers come out, or when letters come in droves, politicians begin to pay attention. I also believe that another activity, mainly of students, is having an impact, and that is the divestment movement, largely led by 350.org. Actually, divestment from fossil fuel in itself is not a climate justice response. You have to go the other way and say divestment from fossil fuel and investment in renewables, because carbon pricing or even divestment can actually put up prices in the short term, and that can be quite harmful. So we need to link getting out of fossil fuel with getting into clean energy as quickly as possible, because that will have enormous beneficial impacts, particularly on the very poorest. Now, let me see. Yeah, there's a question here from Suman Ray. And he says, is the vast importance our world is putting on technology leading us further into accomplishing social inclusion, or deterring us from doing that? Are we relying so much on technology that we've forgotten to physically get involved and be part of their society? And I like that question because it goes back to one of the things I was saying earlier, that local communities very often have very innovative solutions, have thought through their problems, have a lot of wisdom about a lot of indigenous knowledge. And not to draw that out and have people participate in the kind of steps that need to be taken, whether it's in adaptation or minimizing risk, mitigation, whatever. It's wrong just to talk about technologies coming from the outside. That being said, if we are going to stay below 2 degrees Celsius, and obviously the further below we can stay, the more we safeguard the future of small island states, sorry. If we're going to stay below 2 degrees Celsius, we're going to need new technologies. We're going to need better technologies. A technology that I believe is coming and will be extraordinarily important is solar linked to ever better battery storage. And that can be a real deal breaker, because fortunately the sun shines. And actually the sun shines best in some of the poorest places. So if we can get the solar and battery technology linked up in such a way that it's not just the off-grid making a difference in villages and communities and rural communities, but also that it can be harnessed for bigger projects. And we also, I hope, will get to some carbon capture, because if we don't, some effective carbon capture, because if we don't, it's going to be very hard to get to where we need to be. So we do need the technology, but we need a people-centered human rights approach, which I think is what was being called for in that question. Now, where are we? The last question from here in Dublin. Yeah, a report produced by your foundation reports on the importance of South-South sharing of experiences on REDD+ in Guyana. How does your foundation and how can other NGOs or governments promote South-South cooperation and involvement in climate justice conversations? What are the challenges? Again, I like that question because I think it's really going to be extraordinarily important to encourage South-South cooperation. It's happening. There's a lot of cooperation between Brazil and many countries in Africa. China is becoming involved more as in these issues, and the value of a South-South is it's an experience that's much more relevant to the other country. Sometimes the North-South, the gap can be too wide between the solution from the North and the situation in reality in the South, and the North doesn't listen properly, and then the solution doesn't really get it isn't sustainable in that sense. I mean, there have been so many examples, for example, of wells being dug through diesel technology, and as soon as a part breaks down, the local village doesn't know how to fix it. So that's the end of that technology. It's not good anymore. Whereas a South-South approach of digging the well and putting in bricks and having a women's committee to support it has been much more sustainable in the past, and I think that's true. I'm interested that somebody was looking at the early work that we did in relation to Guyana. In truth, I would say Guyana is not an example so much of South-South, because the real link there is with Norway. Norway has supported Guyana in retaining now 95% of its forests, which are actually part of the Amazon, and moving to becoming, I can't remember what Guyana's commitment is to zero carbon, but it's quite strong. And also they have a policy of ensuring that indigenous communities and marginalized and poorer communities benefit from the support. What Norway has done is, I'm not sure if the word pretend is the right thing, is to regard Guyana as a market where there is not a real market, because Norway wants to offset its oil dependency and its emissions on that side. So it has created an opportunity for Guyana. They also work with Indonesia and with and I think with Brazil. But Guyana is actually probably the most successful, although it's the smallest of those, but it is more in effect a north-south. And let me see if there was, I think there was another question that I skipped because yes, this was a question from Amelia Conrad. She says, until quite recently, discussing gender and development meant discussing women. In recent years, organizations have begun to recognize the need to involve men and boys in gender-oriented problems. Men's engagement is critical to changing norms, etc. And then she says, what have been effective mechanisms for incorporating men and boys into gender-based programming? Are there other tools that have been successfully used to steer cultural norms away from those that perpetuate gender inequality? I like that question because, the word gender still is linked to women. as opposed to links to relationships between women and men, men and women. And so I think there is an increasing recognition of the need to involve men. And I'm glad to say that rather late in the day, but now there is a big project of UN women in particular called He for She. Have you heard of He for She? Yeah, and I think that's a good example where men and boys are being encouraged to champion, encouraged to take initiatives, encouraged to become involved. The Elders that I belong to, that was established by Nelson Mandela in 2007, has championed tackling discrimination against women and violence against women. And our greatest champions of that are men, notably Archbishop Desmond Tutu and President Jimmy Carter. They are both very, very strong, very consistent, very outspoken, and very good. So on International Women's Day last year, the 8th of March, those two men participated on behalf of the Elders in a Google conversation on women's equality and gender issues, and that gender isn't just about women, it's about the relationships. And I think we need many more examples where it's men who champion and who are comfortable advocating and championing for the rights of women. I've more or less, I think, run out of questions at this stage. I don't know if we've run out of time as well. Okay, why not?
Thank you for commenting on your role in Elder. That was one of the things we were hoping to comment on as well. Perhaps if you could comment on Ireland's role on climate justice. Obviously, your foundation has done a lot of work, but what have been major successes, in your opinion, in the context of Ireland?
Well, I did mention that conference on hunger, nutrition, climate justice. And I think partly because Ireland had committed to that conference, sorry, and partly because Ireland has a very good reputation on tackling hunger globally. The projects in countries where Irish aid was present on the ground have become remarkable for integrating climate now into the development programs. And I'm very heartened by that because it gets rid of the silos. You know, the development is here and climate is there, and they don't connect. Whereas, as we've been saying, that they are deeply interconnected. And there's a danger that if we don't put a check on the emissions, get us on a pathway to stay below 2 degrees Celsius, that climate will wipe out all the development benefits. And you know that's a stark reality. So by integrating climate, you're also integrating adaptation and new seeds that can survive on swampy ground or in drought, and water management in a way that has climate implications, and so on and so on. And it's very much better. As a former president, I prefer not to comment on Ireland's overall climate picture. That's for others to comment on.
And you like to sit down?
Okay.
Okay, I'm not going to formally close the session. I'm just going to make 1 or 2 observations. Everything that's happened here today has been organized by the year group itself, from the point of contact all the way through to the technical setup, from the selection of the questions right the way through to the organization of the absolutely fantastic sandwiches, which I think somebody has hidden for afterwards. Yeah. All of that has been done by the members of the year group itself, and I'd just like to thank you for your enthusiasm. We couldn't have a better guest. You know, so I'd like to invite one of the year to come forward at this stage, just to kind of formally thank Mrs. Robinson for her participation and for her comment to the full global network also. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you. So my name is Kelly Williamson, and on behalf of our class and the Global Association of MTP, I would like to thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy day to meet with us. And I would also like to thank you for your continued support of this particular program, the Dublin MDP itself. and then also for the amazing work that you do in your foundation. It's been an absolute privilege to have you here today, and thank you very much.
I will just let Matt turn us off at this stage. Yeah.